Thank you, Nadia, and good morning, everyone. So I was invited to speak on potential models for infant antiretroviral prophylaxis to prevent perinatal and postnatal transmission. And I decided to approach this as a bit of a tour. So first, looking back a bit to see how we've gotten to kind of our most recent kind of era of guidance. Pause to consider a few of the landmark studies and events that got us there, and then end with a look forward as to what to anticipate in the future. So I'll start with the beginning. And that first trial of prophylaxis, many people remember, was Pediatric AIDS Clinical Trials Group, or PACTG Protocol 076. This was done in the early 90s when effectively zidovudine was the only antiretroviral that we had to treat HIV. In this study, zidovudine was given antepartum to the mother orally, intrapartum to the mother by IV, and then postpartum to the infant orally for 6 weeks. And it had a really exciting outcome of reducing perinatal transmission by 2/3. This was done in a non-breastfeeding population. So, I mean, it's an understatement to say this was a landmark. This was the first evidence of ARVs used as prophylaxis, not just in infants, but really in any population. It showed that effective in reducing transmission, as we've shown. It really set our model for prophylaxis. Many elements of this remain today in guidelines across the world. And one kind of fun fact for those new to this, it's where we got the 6 weeks. 6 weeks has been like our unit of time in prophylactic trials and protocols, and that's where it came from. So over the subsequent decades, a lot of work was done by many people in this room looking at other approaches and other antiretrovirals. On the left, you'll see a summary. This is from the Women and Infants and Transmission study in the US that just looked at how transmission rates changed as we evolved over this. The font's a bit small, but this is, you can see in the kind of solid lines and the areas under the curve, as it were coverage of maternal treatment. So rising over time up to 2000, starting with zidovudine monotherapy, and then the onset of highly active therapy in dark. And you can see transmission rates by the dotted line declining in that time. And the two big declination points being the results of 076 leading to that implementation, and then the onset of comprehensive active therapy. So really kind of great progress that show really giving, it should be, I guess, not surprising at this point, but giving drugs to mothers and infants help. And studies looked at really different combinations and different durations, and really into the breastfeeding period as well, not just zidovudine, but nevirapine and lamivudine through this period. So in my biggest leap of oversimplification, I'll say over many decades of work and important work, we landed in an approach that we've had up until fairly recently, which is categorizing infants as either high or low risk of transmission based on the mother's status of treatment and viral load, and really a focus on the time around delivery. And then giving infants either one drug if they were low risk, or 2 drugs if they're high risk, and without, again, simplifying the details. Now, you can look to the talk that follows mine from Audrey Becker at a much closer look at what we know about some of the more promising drugs, but we'll say this is where we were about 10 years ago. So what's changed in our thinking around the perinatal infant prophylaxis piece, and I'll talk about breastfeeding next. I think, suffice it to say, the next major landmark in this field was the Mississippi baby. And I think this is now, I guess it's even old news, but still feels pretty fresh. This was a case of a mother who had not had access to treatment during her pregnancy. The newborn was started on 3 drugs at about 30 hours of life, and those were continued until we think somewhere around 15 to 18 months of age, and then through some disengagement and care and such, stopped. When the infant returned and was tested, many were surprised that this infant had no detectable kind of viral load, and really prompted a lot of excitement in the news and, of course, in all of our HIV meetings around that time, with the prospect that this infant had been cured. Now, unfortunately, the infant did rebound with viremia at 46 months of age, but that is a long period of time without rebound, and really opened up a whole new kind of zone of, I guess, promise to say that the potential for early treatment could really change infant outcomes. And I think for many of us, it caused us to kind of go back and think, well, what do we know about the timing of exposure and the timing of infant outcomes over the course of pregnancy and into breastfeeding? The colors get a little bit washed out on what I see here, but you can see, we have in utero, intrapartum exposures, we have delivery, and then of course postpartum and breastfeeding. And I have one kind of model that was put up there, but suffice it to say that with the in utero and intrapartum exposures, if you have the infants kind of born sitting in front of you, more than half of them are going to have been infected in utero, and then half are really going to be just kind of exposed. So it's a significant portion that are actually in utero infected that are, again, sitting in front of you in the delivery room. And so the question then becomes, well, what roles are the ARVs that we're giving these infants at that time in the postpartum period? And so this is the same figure, but just again, looking at what we do. So we're giving our infant drugs starting at the time they're born and for the next stretch of time. But the roles are many. So we are providing post-exposure prophylaxis, as we think of it, as PEP from the in utero and intrapartum exposure. We're also providing it as PrEP for breastfeeding. And breastfeeding is kind of always a little bit of both. It's a little bit of post-exposure and a little bit of PrEP. But the new thought on the block, as it were, was that we really need to be thinking about what we're doing for those infants that are already infected. And so the kind of concept of presumptive treatment was kind of born from that time, and the idea being that we're treating them with the idea that some of them are going to have already been infected, but not yet diagnosed. So many studies were started following that onset of the report of the Mississippi baby that looked at early treatment, and again, many by people in this room, and many of these are ongoing. I've pulled out a couple results from P1115 of impact, but you need to look. We'll talk more about other studies in a minute. But the bottom line is collective kind of across these studies, we've seen that there are potential benefits for early treatment. A lot of look at DNA reservoirs, and some from the Epical Earth cohort, in fact, to be summarized in this meeting and look for the presentation tomorrow, I've shown that reservoirs decline more rapidly with early treatment. But for a long time, we were waiting to see, well, okay, that's fine. Reservoirs and these markers look good, but really, are we going to get to a new clinical phenotype, a new outcome like the Mississippi baby? And we saw last year at CROI the results from 1115, where they finally, after an interruption with the pandemic, were able to go through with their analytic treatment interruptions and did indeed show that 3 of 6 infants that had gone through this interruption seemed to have entered a remission phenotype. So extremely exciting news to see that there is a potential for really changing outcomes. Now, how did this impact guidance across the world? I highlighted the US, but really across a lot of other countries, practice changed almost immediately. I think people just started doing it with 3 drugs as they had comfort with these drugs from treatment of infants to know that they were relatively safe. It took a while for guidelines themselves to adopt it. I think initially there was kind of framing around it being, well, some experts might, and then it gradually kind of got into guidance as more standard practice. I think understandably and appropriately, the WHO was a little more cautious in adopting these guidelines, but as you saw this morning, they are now incorporated as well in WHO guidance with the cumulative data that show this possible benefit, and of course, now the clinical outcomes. So 3 drugs for high-risk infants was announced just today, and I think it's an exciting, and it's time for that to be rolled out across the world. So there are, of course, many still outstanding questions around presumptive treatment. Why do some infants achieve this and not? You saw it was still 3 of 6. Kind of why is that? Is it related to timing of infection, other factors? A lot of work to be done there, and a number of ongoing studies, as I mentioned, are shown their side. So we'll have to look to those for some results. Have to look at different combinations, not just with small molecules, but BNAbs and other approaches of these combinations to get better outcomes. But I think also for the other half of the room that aren't doing those trials, we have to think about how to operationalize presumptive treatment. It's easy to say 3 drugs, but we don't really know how long is the right amount of time. We don't know the impact on testing. Of course, suppressive combinations like that will impact the sensitivity of testing. And I think we're really going to have to derive data from people in the room and their clinical experience on how this rolls out to learn a little bit more about those operational questions. Okay, so turning now to breastfeeding. What's new in our thinking around prophylaxis during breastfeeding? This is a figure we've seen and had an update this morning, but unfortunately the numbers really have not changed. We've seen a pattern of great progress with ART coverage in pregnant and breastfeeding women, but that has kind of flattened around the 80s globally, and unfortunately so has thus the transmission and new infections in children flattened at around 100,000 or a little bit over, unfortunately, per year. And around 50% of that is happening during breastfeeding. So we still have really important work to do when it comes to prevention during the breastfeeding period. So what are the gaps in that period? This is the kind of stacked bar approach, I think, first put forth by Mary Mahey, and a really useful way to think about understanding when infant infections are occurring and where are the gaps. And you can see kind of the color coding there of it being red being because the mother acquired HIV during pregnancy, and in orange because she didn't receive therapy. It's kind of the cascade, as you can see. In teal, the didn't continue the therapy, and then in blue was on therapy but viremic. And so really every step of the cascade, and we really need to address these first and foremost for the health of women, every step of that cascade: prevention, testing, linkage, treatment, and retention. But that leads us to ask, so, where's our work still in infants? I think we need to remember the postpartum period in particular is really high risk for women. These are data from the ORCID cohort in South Africa. And on the left of this slide, you can see kind of outcomes. Those starts during pregnancy, and on the far right is 48 weeks postpartum. And you can see that those initiating and switching therapy have real dramatic loss of virologic suppression in the course of the postpartum period. The middle of that figure is postpartum period. Those continuing do pretty well. But another pattern I think that we need to recognize is viremia is really dynamic in that period. And those plots on the right are kind of individual curves. And you can see basically it's a mess. It's a kind of a scattered of spaghetti. And it really reflects that some women are going in and out of virologic control, and really hard to predict and hard to accommodate that with our postnatal period prophylaxis. So how effective can maternal treatment be at preventing transmission? We had a great presentation by Dr. Muffinson in 2020 at this meeting, which took on this question of, U equals U in breastfeeding, and does it apply? And the take-home slide from that presentation remains true today, which is, well, we think in the most optimal circumstance, if you have perfect suppression from before pregnancy and through, it's probably pretty close to zero. But that's really the optimal state. And unfortunately, as I showed you in the last slide, that's not one that we can presume from women, that even those that are suppressed at the time of delivery. I think we want to see how much better we'll do with dolutegravir, and a lot of hope for long-acting regimens to improve that. But I think it's still likely to be, unfortunately, many years until we really have achieved that state. And we need to ask ourselves, what do we do in the meanwhile? Infant prophylaxis, I think we think of as the safety net. But of course, mothers, if they're having trouble with their own adherence, are going to have trouble potentially with infant adherence. And I mean, the PROMISE study, again, showed us how well we can do with maternal treatment or infant prophylaxis, getting to sub 1% levels of transmission during breastfeeding. But that was in a pretty highly supported trial structure. We need to think about how we can do better than that, and how we can do better than that in the real world. This slide just summarizes a couple of the kind of barriers I've just mentioned. I think, how are we going to think about the next models for prophylaxis during breastfeeding? Many challenges to the barriers of and the treatment cascade for mothers, the dynamic viremia that occurs in the postpartum period, our limited ability to test and to detect those bumps in viremia, and then, of course, barriers with infant prophylaxis. And I've added to this slide our challenge in studying these. It's great to have these transmission rates below 1% or single digit, but of course, people in clinical research will quickly recognize that it gets much harder to study, and you have to use much bigger trials, very expensive trials, and harder to operate. So a real impediment to studying new interventions. So just to touch on a few potential solutions, I think we need to really be thinking more, not just about the drugs, of which we have many potent, but really thinking about these in the context of strategies that incorporate maternal treatment and viral load testing. We need to find ways to address that dynamic risk of viremia, and we need to think about how we're going to get these to places where it's feasible and where transmission is occurring. And I think our research shift has to be a little bit more towards looking at effectiveness and not efficacy, looking at feasibility, acceptability, and cost, and really having some of our tools now with implementation science be used to compare these regimens. I think what's going to bump dolutegravir off that list are going to be, what's better in the implemented setting, not so much whether it's a more potent drug. And then we need to lean into our biostatisticians for better designs and hybrid effectiveness designs that will allow us to get there and study these things appropriately. And then, of course, a lot of promise from long-actings. I do want to highlight what I think is the major study of the decade in postnatal prophylaxis, which is the PROMISE EPI study. This study was done in Zambia and in Burkina Faso, and basically infants were randomized to lamivudine during the course of breastfeeding. And what's really nice about this study is they did the risk categorization based on kind of a realistic testing of mothers at the first EPI-2 visit at 6 weeks and then at 6 months. They had a very profound result of reduction in transmission in the intervention arm. It didn't reach statistical statistical significance, I think related, in fact, they had some losses to follow-up and just overall rates. As I mentioned, it's hard to study with overall rates. But in the intervention arm, they had only a single transmission, and that transmission was related to a case where the infant hadn't even received drugs for the 5 months prior to the diagnosis. And so a real powerful proof of concept, or at least promise of concept, that ART given to infants of mothers on ART can work very well. And I really think it's a good example of the kinds of studies we need to be thinking about doing when we look at postnatal prophylaxis approaches. So just to close, a few thoughts. I think we still have a lot of promise. I think, we keep talking about the era of long-acting agents. I feel like I've said that in every talk for the last 3 years. It still is that era, and we're still entering it. And we still haven't seen the full benefits of these come all the way down to the newborn period. We have extremely promising results in adults, of course, with cabotegravir and lenacapavir. We're now inching away from 1 month to 2 month to 6 month dosing. We have a real promising pipeline and hope around BNABs as a whole new kind of class of approach, very well tolerated, could also get to long dispensation times. And we have great commitment and partnerships with pharma, some done under the witness of the Pope. You can see that's a picture of the Vatican there. So I think we have good hope that we'll have good support from our pharma partners, and we have a really exciting pipeline even beyond these agents coming. So a lot of promise for these agents, and many of which could surmount barriers to adherence with their long-acting kind of capacity. But of course, as Dr. Motvinson summarized at the beginning, we have a lot of concern in the next phase. We have reduction in U.S. federal administration infrastructure entirely in funding with global impacts. We have, just to be blunt, destruction of clinical and research infrastructure globally, affecting many communities represented in this room for sure. We have a reduction in supply of drugs and testing in addition to the kind of human power. And then a fear that this is also going to delay initiation of the number of new drugs and dosing in infants because of we can't do our part of that partnership with pharma to get those drugs to kids. So a lot of concern and a lot of need for us to stay together. And then many questions remain, of course, and just a few here, but hopefully we'll talk about more there. We focused on high risk, but I still look forward to the day when we don't have to give a baby anything. Like when we can get rid of that 2 weeks of zidovudine or that 6 weeks of nevirapine and really have them, mothers and their infants, live like those without affected by HIV. I think we will look to long-actings. We need to ensure access. And I'll just close by saying, sadly, I think we need to really keep looking at how we're going to implement these things without access to the viral load and diagnostic testing that I think is really kind of important given our resource limitations. So I'll close there. Thank you.